Thank you. So I'm here to introduce a fantastic and distinguished guest, Latha Reddy. She's the co-chair of the Global Commission on Cyber Stability, who was also the Deputy National Security Advisor of India, apart from an illustrious career in the Indian Foreign Service. She's in our midst. Can I please ask Latha Reddy to join us on stage, please? And in conversation with Latha on this extremely interesting topic, we could have had no one better than Dr. Madan Oberoi, Executive Director, Technology and Innovation at Interpol, with rich experience in anti-terrorism and cybercrime in India. Dr. Oberoi.
Welcome, friends, and thank you, Saket, for introducing our topic. We all are now aware of what are the threats which are facing us, the security challenges which are facing us. A normal strategy which is being advocated in cyberspace, if I draw a physical analogy, is putting more locks, bigger locks, more locks, and whereas in physical space, we depend upon bringing more certainty of consequences on the criminal. And probably that is lacking in cyberspace. And why it is happening that way and what is the global environment is the theme for this topic. But after such an interesting presentation, you have two civil servants, one former, one present. A boring couple on this to discuss more boring issues. So my apologies that we won't be able to match the energy and interest level which Saket generated, but let me try that. So first of all, ma'am, I'll ask you this question on a personal level, that you are a career diplomat, you served in Indian Foreign Service, and apparently before joining this area, you did not have a technology background. So what was it which made you look into cyber issues and that too cyber security issues?
Well, thank you, Madan. I have a confession to make to all of you. I am a fraud because, people always assume that somebody who talks about cybersecurity or cyber policy has to be technically very accomplished. And we certainly saw that with Saket's presentation. But I think what inspired me when I became Deputy National Security Advisor was that I was asked by the Prime Minister, by the National Security Advisor, to look at what India was doing on cybersecurity in terms of government policies and to make recommendations. And what I found really made me into what I would call a cyber peace warrior, and that's how I describe myself. I had enormous technical support from my colleagues in the IT department, in defense, from people like Madan, whom I've been interacting with since then. And, I was convinced that if we didn't fix this problem, or at least try to fix this problem, we would really be in very deep trouble as a country, as a people, and as a government. So what did we do? We tried to build a cybersecurity architecture within the government to clearly say which department would be responsible for what area. We also created a joint working group between the private sector and the government. Many of the private sector CEOs who came to those meetings told me it was the first time they'd ever been in the Prime Minister's office. And I think it was a tremendous vote of confidence in them that we said, we want you to be our partners in this. Unfortunately, though these initiatives were very good, and we also wrote the cybersecurity policy of India, we were only the third country to have a cybersecurity policy. Some of the implementation has been slower than it should be. And some of the problems about turf battles, empire building between different ministries and departments still continues till today. But I'd like to feel that our efforts helped in some way. So when I finally retired from the government 6 years ago, and I was asked to become the unofficial voice of India on the global stage to talk about cyber policies and what should be the international cooperation aspects that we look at, I was delighted to take this up, and I spend most of my time really on talking about cyber policies. I'm the co-chair of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. I also served on the Global Commission on Internet Governance, and you saw the little video about what we're trying to do on the Global Commission. So that's how I got interested, and I've stayed interested and engaged. Madan and I have interacted on many occasions. He came to the first Global Commission, gave us a presentation on the deep and dark web, so don't believe him. He's being very modest. He's one of our most accomplished technical experts on crime prevention in the cyber world, and I'm sure he's created a very good infrastructure within Interpol.
Thank you, ma'am. My next question, which I had planned, was how serious is the cybersecurity threat? I think I need not raise that question. Maybe Saket has already illustrated. But to rephrase it, when we look at the national level, so how serious is the threat to the nation states, and how prepared are we as national governments to protect ourselves as well as our citizens?
I don't think any government in the world, any country in the world is totally prepared. I think all of us have varying levels of preparedness. Some countries, and I would specifically point to Singapore, I think have done very well in creating cybersecurity agencies that are effective. And others have very diffused areas of dealing with cybersecurity, which perhaps makes them less effective. But as I said, there's no ideal model to follow. Obviously, there are rankings in the world on who is more prepared and who is less prepared. And, but I think I'd like to turn the question around and say, should it be a national preparedness or should it be an international preparedness? We often talk about the cyber world being a world without borders. You can perhaps create a secure system within your own country, theoretically. But considering you're going to get messages from all over the world, and people all over the world are going to have access to your cyberspace, your data, how would that help unless you have some kind of international cooperation and agreement? And although given our geopolitical environment, it seems impossible to reach a complete global consensus, I think we owe it to the world to try. And if we don't do that, we are really going to ruin this very excellent medium which has been created for international and global communication.
So that brings me, ma'am, to the next part, is that the role of cyber diplomacy and what is happening. And if we look at, a lot of efforts have been happening at UN level. We had the GGE, the group of governmental experts, which I think received a setback last year. And then we had the open-ended working group on this, trying to bring out certain norms for accepted behavior in the cyberspace. So where is this leading to? Are we heading towards a situation where we will have a kind of globally accepted norms for ethical behavior in cyberspace? Are we heading for a global organization which can resolve the differences?
Well, I'm glad you asked me this, Madan, because this is really something that takes up a great deal of our time and energy in the Global Commission. Firstly, how are you going to interact with the various bodies? Because obviously the UN GGE or the UN governmental group of experts, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, has had several sittings over the years. The 2015 UN GGE seemed very successful, and they reached consensus on 11 global norms that called on states not to indulge in certain kinds of behavior, whether it was not attacking each other's critical information infrastructure, whether it was not attacking each other's computer emergency response teams, and so on. But unfortunately, the GGE that met in 2017 was a failure in the sense that they could not reach consensus, and they even went back a little on what they had accepted in 2015. To my way of thinking, we go back to what the High Commissioner was saying earlier this morning. It's the geopolitics which are affecting this, because right now, as you all know, Western countries, the US in particular, and Europe to a certain extent, are very anti-Russia. So Russia is somehow left out of a lot of global discussions, left out of the like-minded group. And therefore, the Russians have come forward with an open-ended working group, which they say is open to all UN countries, as compared to the UN group of governmental experts, which has carefully handpicked 20, 25 countries, who are normally fairly major powers. And the idea is, why should it be an exclusive club, which is essentially controlled by one way of thinking? It should be an open-ended process. So the UN Secretary General has accepted the proposal to have an open-ended working group. In fact, the UN General Assembly accepted that because a number of countries feel unhappy at being left out of the UN GGE and feel that the UN open-ended working group will give them place to voice their views.
Ma'am, what is the organization which you co-chair?
Yes.
Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace.
That's
what is
right.
it doing in this regard?
Well, in this regard, for one thing, we are interacting definitely with the UN GGE. We've already started talking to the Secretariat, and we've set up some meetings which will be starting from this month onwards in New York and in other places. We are also talking to the open-ended working group. In fact, I'm going to be in New York to brief the representatives of all the countries who are in the open-ended working group on what we are doing in the Global Commission and how we feel we can move forward. The big difference in the way we operate from the way the UN operates is that the UN looks at what states should be doing or not be doing. The Global Commission says states and non-state actors. And non-state actors includes private sector, civil society, academia, and and we have to look at non-state actors in the negative sense also, because it could be hackers, it could be cyber criminals, it could be a whole variety of issues. So what we are saying is that everybody should refrain from certain kinds of activities in cyberspace, because we run the risk of actually destroying this medium, or fragmenting it at least. So, and people would start regarding it with fear and suspicion rather than as a valuable tool of communication.
Ma'am, you mentioned about private sector, and there's a growing feeling that there's a tremendous power shift which is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Power is being shifted now from the government to private sector,
That's
especially
right.
in the cyberspace. So how important would be their role in enforcement of any norm if they are framed?
Well, I think the cyber, if you ask me, I think the global technical community has done better, private sector has done better than governments in terms of reaching certain consensus. When you look at the Tech Accord, when you look at Microsoft's Digital Peace Initiative, you look at Microsoft's Digital Geneva Convention, there are Siemens initiative, for example. There have been a tremendous number of initiatives to which almost all major global cyber companies have signed up. And I think that in that sense, they really regard this as an international medium, because most of the big platforms don't see themselves as belonging to one nation. They see their market as global. They see the needs they have to answer from governments or from users as global. And I think that if there is a risk of fragmentation or balkanization, which I think we're going to talk about a little later, it actually comes from those who do not see it as being globally connected.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. I think it was a very big, very good overview of the big picture, but maybe we can take some questions from the audience.
Sure.
And the first question which I will take is, how do we address the cyber risk from rogue state actors? They have different level of resource availability as well as motivation.
I would agree, but I think, let's talk about, I'll give you an analogy. Let's look at nuclear, right? If you didn't have the nuclear non-proliferation agreement, how many rogue states would there be that were clandestinely developing nuclear capability? Today you talk about 2 or 3. Pakistan and India say that they were never in violation because we never signed the NPT. But I think the issue is you would have many more countries clandestinely buying nuclear technology, nuclear weapon technology, if you did not have the IAEA as a watchdog, if you did not have an agreement on non-proliferation in place. So it's exactly the same. The analogy could be extended to the cyber world as well. You must have some agreement, some mechanism in place to monitor what's happening.
Ma'am, another related question is, how does India position itself on cyber security versus cost consideration, example Huawei, etc., or other government-linked companies who provide critical infrastructure?
This is has been a real issue in India for a long time. As you all know, and you would have read and heard about this, the US and other powers have put India under a great deal of pressure not to buy Huawei 5G technology. There was a time when if you remember, Madan, when we were both in government, there was a time when they also said that every bit of equipment being used in highly sensitive sectors would have to be manufactured in India. We would have to have the source codes and so on. But ultimately, when it came down to it, we were not able to implement it because you come under a tremendous amount of pressure from foreign governments who see their exports to you being affected. And finally, the decisions are taken on global, I would say, geopolitical considerations and a quid pro quo where perhaps you get something you want from that country and you agree to waive these conditions. So from time to time, I've seen this cropping up. But it doesn't really resolve the problem. So I think the question is, should each country be free to buy the technology that most suits it and is most affordable? My answer to that would be, say, absolutely.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. I think to summarize, we can say we are heading for a situation where the need for a global agency is very strongly felt, but we are nowhere near to creating that agency. There's no unanimity on how it should be structured, under what agency it should be created. And the need for involvement of different stakeholders is also very clearly emphasized. But ultimately, it depends upon the individual nation states how they structure their own cybersecurity policy as of now. I had some very interesting questions. Maybe they can be answered offline because we are running short of time.
We have another panel coming up, so perhaps we could answer them there. But I just wanted to say one final word, Madan, before we conclude. And that is, is cyberspace a global commons? What is a global commons? A global commons is something that belongs to all mankind. So air, space, the oceans are considered global space, a global commons. But there has been a consistent effort from countries who have been controlling cyberspace to say that no, cyberspace is not a global commons. But my question is, if it becomes a universal means of communication, and if the largest users of the internet are India and China, how can it not be a global commons? So I think that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.